Welcome to Stand With Us. I'm Roz Rothstein, and today we're here with Shir Menuhin. Did I say that correctly?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. And Shir is traveling on college campuses for Stand With Us and telling her story about her family history, a story of Jews being thrown out of Arab countries, basically in the 1950s and 1960s. We saw Jewish people being thrown out of their homes that they had lived in for centuries. And as a matter of fact, in Libya, we went from thousands of Jews to 0 Jews. And in other countries, you know, very similar numbers. Your family comes from Iraq, is that right?
Yeah, my family actually comes from Baghdad, from the capital. And they've been there for generations. I mean, the Jewish community in Baghdad dates back 2,600 years ago. And this is actually the reason that when by 1950, most of the Jewish community has left the country because Israel was established, and suddenly the Jews were seen as the enemies and were made very clear that they no longer can stay in Iraq. At that point, my mother's father, who was a very prominent lawyer in the community, was saying, well, this is my country for centuries, as you said. I've been born here, my father was been born here, and, you know, so is our history here. And he knew at that point that things are turbulent, but he really believed in the law system. He was a man of the law, and he really believed that at one point things will reside and he will be able to live his life there. And this is actually when my mother, the eldest of 4, was born in 1950. So this is basically how the story starts out.
So let me just interrupt you. So you're saying by the 1950s, your family mainly had already left.
Correct.
Okay, so, but your uncle wanted to remain?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
Your grandfather wanted to remain?
Mm-hmm.
Did he?
Yes, he did. The fact was that by 1950, there was a community of around 130,000 Jews living in Iraq. They were 25% of the general population in Baghdad. There was very heavy Jewish presence in the area, but at that point, most of the Jewish community left either to Israel, to the States, to London, and so on. And a community of a few thousands remained in Baghdad, and he was one of the people who actually chose to stay.
How many, so what was that like? Did you hear those stories about what it was like to stay?
Well, you know, a lot of people ask this question because they don't really realize that there were Jews still living in Iraq after 1950. And the thing is, my mother was born in 1950, and most of her immediate family, other than her close member of the family, were already in Israel, so she grew up not really knowing any of her distant family members. But the thing is that they actually had a pretty good life. I mean, her father was right with his predictions, and within a few years things resided, and my mother was able to go to this Jewish school. She studied both in French and in English. She got very good education until 1967, when the Six-Day War broke out. And then it was made again very clear to the Jews that they can no longer stay living in Iraq. And by that I mean that at that point, their possessions were confiscated, their bank accounts were frozen, they couldn't get a job anymore, her father couldn't work, she couldn't work. She was just about to finish her high school diploma, and at that point she had a boyfriend, and he moved to Israel, and she started thinking about her future there because she was about to attend the University of Baghdad.
Now, at this point, how many Jewish people were still, in 1967, approximately how many Jewish people were there still in Baghdad?
I'm assuming there were a couple of thousands, but I'm not really sure about the numbers. This is just a general estimation. I mean, today, according to some of the information that is known within the Jewish community, there are about 5 Jews living in Baghdad. So really, from a community of 130,000 Jews, literally none are living there.
So their accounts were frozen, they couldn't get jobs. I mean, it crashed down very quickly, and it was the result of the 1967 war that sort of turned it again, right? It always feels like it's right under the surface everything that about this anti-Semitism and, you know, the hatred, the age-old hatred of the Jewish people, right under the surface. And if you scratch it with like a 67 Six-Day War, then all of a sudden it's all back. It's
Yeah, I believe that, you know, in these regimes, they're constantly looking for scapegoats. And as a minority living in Iraq, the Jews were an easy target in that sense. So again, in 1967, that was when the Ba'ath Party, later ruled by Saddam Hussein, was starting to take over the regime there, and it was a very easy target, the Jews again. So I really think that, you know, it's interesting that you were asking about the life that my mother had there in Iraq, because she was telling me that her father, for instance, who had a law office, he had Muslim attorneys working for him. And actually in 2013, when the documentary about my mother's life and her search for her father was released, I learned for the first time that my grandfather was involved in releasing many of the Jews who tried to escape at the end of the 60s, tried to escape Iraq and flee elsewhere. But we really never knew these stories. What had happened is that in the late 60s, after the Six-Day War, Jews were trying to flee the country. Many times they were stopped at the borders, and someone had to come and pay the bail for them. At that point, my grandfather could no longer work because he was Jewish, and so he had Muslim attorneys who used to work for him. So they would go and sign the bail in his name, and these Jews who try to flee the country would commit to him that they wouldn't try to leave the country again, which eventually didn't happen, and they did flee the country. So my grandfather had in his name all these people who were trying to leave the country and did leave the country eventually.
Okay, so we're going to be right back. We're going to take a commercial break. Very interesting and sad story about how Jews were treated and then thrown out of countries that, I mean, unfortunately, we have materials on this, by the way, and we would encourage you to read them. I think it's Jewish Refugees from Middle Eastern Countries. I think that's what it's called. And hopefully after this show, we can show you that booklet that you can order at no cost if you write to shipping@standwithus.com and say you watched the show, you'd like one copy of this booklet. So we'll be right back with Sheer, and so don't go away.